Hi everyone. Do you ever struggle like I do to find time to be quiet and still and meditate on scripture or on things that God has done for you, taking time to be thankful, things like that? Life can be really crazy and extremely demanding. And it seems like every time I turn around, there's more to do. You knock a couple things off your to-do list, you add another 10 more. There's always something grabbing for our attention. And if we aren't careful, those things can crowd out what God is trying to do in our lives. I want to look at a verse in Luke chapter 2 that tells us how Mary took the time. And in verse 19, it says, Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. This was after she just gave birth to Jesus. The shepherds came and worshiped. All these things were happening. It was this really unusual and surprising experience. And Mary took the time to ponder these things. She treasured these things. We see the same thing in Luke chapter 2, verse 51, a little bit later on. And this is after Mary and Joseph kind of lose Jesus for a little while. They find him in the temple, and he's waxing eloquent with all the teachers of the law and kind of showing off a little bit. And Mary and Joseph are like, what's wrong with you? Why did you do this? We were terrified. And he says, you should have known I'd be here. And Mary, it says, treasured up all these things in her heart. And so twice we see in that one chapter that Mary treasured, pondered, meditated, reflected on these things that were happening in her life. Too often we miss what's happening in our lives. We live it and we're experiencing it, but we don't always understand it. And if we don't take the time to ponder and to consider that there's a reason for the chaos, there's a reason for the weird things that we're experiencing or the good things that we're experiencing and everything in between, then we can miss what God is doing and we can miss opportunities to grow in our relationship with Him. The words that are translated treasure, there's actually two different Greek words in each of those verses that are translated to treasured. They both mean the same thing. They mean to keep carefully, to preserve, keep safe, keep close. And so it is an idea of sitting down, taking a kind of evaluation of what's going on in your life, and taking the time to keep it close, keep it in the forefront, carefully consider it, keep bringing it to mind, keep dwelling and reflecting on what it means and what God is doing. We don't always know initially what God is doing, but the more that we reflect on these things, the more God can show us and open our eyes and our hearts to what He's doing in our lives. The hurried and hectic pace of our lives can sometimes interfere with that. And that's why it's important that we take the time and make a point to be reflective. And that may mean doing it at a specific time every day. It may mean that you do it at a specific time every week. Maybe one in-between way of doing it would be carrying a perhaps small notebook with you. I actually have a little notebook, if I can find it here. Looks like this, that I carry around with me. Of course, I sometimes forget it's with me because it's in my bigger computer bag. But what I have in here, I can show you, is a list. And it's a lot of little things. And these are things that I write down as I go throughout my day, particularly if I have a more difficult day. There's just page after page of these kinds of things, and it starts off with, this is how I fight my battles. So it's a little bit different direction, but it's my gratitude notebook. And when God is doing something in my life and I want to take the time to remember it, whether it's something small or big, I write it down in here. And it gives me an opportunity to keep it in the forefront of my mind. It makes me stop and ponder. When I'm having a particularly frustrating day, it's particularly frustrating to do this exercise, but it makes a difference because it gets me out of my frustration and fixated on what God is doing. And so then I begin to be more reflective throughout my day and considering these things because I took the time to write it down. Later, I can go back, and I love being able to do that with my gratitude journals, and I don't do it enough, and I don't write in these enough, but sometimes I can look back and I can go down the list and I can see different things where I got something out of a devotional that I read, or I got a new outfit at the store, things that Cameron did for me. I can look back and I can see these things and I can remember and I can be grateful. And so sometimes that can be helpful when you do it on a weekly basis. You just sit down and look at, what did God do this week? What can I learn from this week? What can I be thankful for this week? Sometimes the things I would write were not so much happy things, they were more painful things, but I made a point to be thankful for what God was doing even in those moments. And it caused me to be more reflective and say, you know what, even in pain and difficulties, God is at work, and I may not understand it yet, but I'm going to choose to be thankful. And then maybe it's not weekly that I can sit down and look back at that, but maybe monthly or maybe yearly I can be able to sit back and look and say, look what God was doing. Now I see it, and I can see what he was doing, and I'm considering it, and I'm dwelling on it, and I'm praying about it, and I'm reflecting on it, and I'm choosing to see his hand in what's happening. And I'm going to let him speak to me through this experience. And so I hope that you'll find a way to make reflecting a priority. Mary was a woman who understood the importance of treasuring and reflecting and meditating on what God was doing in her life. And I think that when we do that, we will find that we also will be able to be influential women, godly women, who are able to exhibit his grace and his love in our lives because of our reflective nature, where we don't take anything for granted, we don't assume anything, but we carefully consider what God's doing in our lives so that not only we can learn from it, but that we can share it with others.